The 1920s were a difficult time, but some say they were made even more difficult with the passage of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution on January 17, 1920. The amendment, better known as Prohibition, made the manufacture and sale of alcohol illegal, with one exception. The amendment allowed families to make limited amounts of wine and cider for their own consumption. By the time Henry Bosco was born in 1923, Henry's parents were running the Star Hotel and looking for other ways to make ends meet. Henry's father, Mike, was well respected by the Italian farmers and ranchers who had worked their way out of the mines and onto the land by the 1920s. Here Hank remembers his dad and mom and life during Prohibition. The Italians figured large in the settlement of this valley, didn't they?
Yes, they did. And that sort of, as time passed, there was a thing called Prohibition that was a federal law that banned the sale of alcohol. Italians have to have a glass of wine with their meals. It's as important as a slice of bread. And my dad saw an opportunity there. So he connected up with a vineyard in California in a town called Lodi, Lodi. And you could buy a permit at the post office for $5 that would permit you to make up to 50 gallons of wine for your own personal use. You couldn't sell it, of course, but in respect to Europeans mainly who had to have their wine, they made that concession. Because of the number of Italians in this valley from Aspen all the way down to, Rifle, really. Dad began going around knocking on doors. Would you be interested in buying some grapes to make wine? Yes, Okay. How many would you want? Well, varying amounts. And then when they were ready for harvesting in California, they would call Dad, and he'd jump in his old Chevy and head for California and go out in there to the vineyards and select the grapes he wanted picked. Take this row and this row. I don't want this row. I want to take this row. They would custom pick the grapes, so he always had pretty good grapes, and then he'd jump in his car and come back. Well, this thing developed into quite an enterprise for him, and it was through the Depression years. And actually, the little Star Hotel kept a roof over our heads, but little else. And our grocery money came from the sale of the grapes. And he shipped as many as 6 railroad carloads.
Really?
And what he would do, he would consolidate for one carload for one area. Like the first carload, he would spot at Rifle. And anyone who had an order in that car, they'd tell him when it would arrive, and he'd get on the phone and call him. The grapes are going to be here next Tuesday, and you got to pick them up by Friday. And because on Friday, the next car would arrive in Newcastle, and the next one in Glenwood and Carbondale and Woody Creek. And so it just progressed. He had the cars coming at intervals, and he'd call them up and tell them, come and get their grapes. And they were always able to have their wine with their dinner.
That must have been quite a sight, the
Yeah.
arrival of the grapes in those communities.
Yeah. They came in wooden crates, no top, just
Stacked one on the other?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the refrigerator cars that they came in, they really were not refrigerated as we think of it today. At the end of each boxcar was a big bin that they would fill with ice. And on top of the boxcar, there were vents that would open, and the air would come in over that ice and keep that car just almost ice cold. you know, it would. Those grapes come here like they'd just been picked. In the summertime, when I was out of school, I used to go with my dad, ride with him to go around and take orders for grapes. And he'd always fill a couple of kind of wash tubs full of ice and beer and go out to these different French Italian people that were out working in their fields or wherever. And he'd always bring cold beer to them and then ask them if they wanted to order grapes. And he made a lot of friends. He sort of became an advisor to many of these people who had legal things that needed to be done. He didn't practice law by a long shot, but he would help them arrange to bring other relatives to this country and help them arrange with their passports and transportation, etc. So he developed a lot of close friendships through the grape business. In fact, he had that little star hotel, and a good friend of his named Art Kendrick, Art and Mary Kendrick, owned the Denver Hotel, and they were an older couple, childless, no heirs. Art came to Dad one day and said, "Mike, I want to retire. I want to sell the Denver Hotel. I want to sell it to you." And Dad said, "No, there's no way, Art, that I could handle something like that." He said, "Well, I happen to know that you have a lot of good, close friends up the valley that are fairly well-to-do, and I'll bet you, if you want to work at it, you can find somebody to stake you to it." Well, he thought and said, "Well, maybe that'll work," and it did. He, I won't mention his name, but he loaned Dad the money for the down payment on the Denver Hotel. And he said, "Mike, I don't know anything about real estate in town, but I know you, and if you think it's a good deal, I'll stake you." And it was just a gentleman's agreement, a handshake, and it worked out pretty well. So, back to the little Star Hotel. Dad was a volunteer fireman. I haven't touched on that yet. He was a volunteer fireman for 20 years, and I can remember as a little kid, he had a pair of fireman's boots that came up to his knees. They were like rubber boots. And then he had some canvas pants, fireman's pants, and he'd keep those pants down around the ankles of the boots. When there was a fire, the central, which was a telephone operator, would ring a bell in every volunteer fireman's house. It was like a doorbell. And when that doorbell would ring, my dad would jump up, and he'd jump in those boots and pull the pants up and grab his coat, and away he'd go to the fire. Well, then after that, they had a big gong on the City Hall, which is up about where the telephone building is on Grand Avenue near the Springs Theater. They had a big gong, and they would ring that when there was a fire. But I can remember it was quite an event when the city got rid of the gong and they bought an electric siren that you could hear it all over the valley. It was a loud thing, like an air raid siren. And that's how, if there was a fire, somebody'd call the operator and she'd turn on the siren and call everybody out. When that siren would blow, everybody in town had come running to see where the fire was. Of course, the town wasn't all that big in those days. I have a picture of my parents on their wedding day, taken right up there in front of the City Hall, which was near where the Springs Theater is. They're on the fire truck. And they're handcuffed to the fire truck, and they're dressed in their finest, And the fire truck has hard rubber tires. The surface of Grand Avenue was mud. You could see the ruts in the mud. But then all of his friends who were volunteers were all dressed up in their Sunday best too, and they're all different positions all over the fire truck holding up signs saying, "Oh boy, pity me," and and I often look at that and laugh.
What are the memories you cherish of your parents?
Gosh, I guess I admired them for what they accomplished in their life. I I just the challenges they faced, and I was as a kid I never gave it much thought as a youngster, but when I got in high school, I kind of developed an inferiority complex because I was an Italian, and I think Italians were somewhat looked down upon back in those days. They were coal miners and hard rock miners, and they were not the elite people of the world. And I carried that phobia for a long time, and finally gotten over it.
That was Henry Bosco remembering life in the 1920s. If you'd like to hear more of Hank's story, please go to part 2 of this interview, where he remembers growing up in the Star Hotel and life in the 1930s.